My husband cheated on me with my own daughter-in-law. I lost everything, my car, my house, my job. He said I would never get back on my feet. Living on favors in a 40-square-foot room, I found a dusty folder with my name on it. Inside, there was a plane ticket to Cairo and a note. Just go. Your true fortune awaits you. When I arrived and saw what was waiting for me, everything changed. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment what city you are watching from. That way, I can see how far my story has reached. I am Eleanor. I'm 59 years old, and I never thought my life would fall apart on a Tuesday afternoon while coming home early from work with flowers for my husband. Richard and I had been married for 32 years. 32 years of building a life together, of raising our son Michael, of being the perfect daughter-in-law to my mother-in-law, and the exemplary wife who cooked his favorite meals every Sunday. I thought I knew his every gesture, every sigh, every way he furrowed his brow when reading the morning paper. That Tuesday, I had left the office early because I wanted to surprise him. We had had a little argument the night before, one of those silly things about who had forgotten to buy milk, and I wanted to make peace. I bought his favorite flowers, some yellow chrysanthemums that always reminded him of his mother, and drove home humming that song we used to dance to at our wedding. The front door was ajar. Strange, because Richard was always meticulous about the locks. I walked in quietly, thinking of surprising him in his study, where he spent his afternoons reviewing company documents. The flowers trembled in my hands when I heard voices coming from the second floor. Voices I recognized immediately, Richard's voice, but also another voice, a voice I had known for 8 years, ever since my son got married, the voice of Jessica, my daughter-in-law. I climbed the stairs as if I were floating, as if my feet weren't really touching the hardwood steps I had polished myself that morning. The sound grew clearer with each step. Laughter, whispers, the unmistakable creak of the bed Richard and I had shared for over 3 decades. I stood frozen in front of our bedroom door, which was cracked open. My heart was beating so fast I thought they might hear it. Through the crack, I could see what destroyed my world in an instant. Richard, my Richard. He was holding Jessica in our bed. She was wearing my blue silk robe, the one he had given me for our 20th anniversary. His hands caressed my daughter-in-law's hair with a tenderness he hadn't shown me in years. Eleanor is never going to find out, I heard Jessica say, laughing as if it were the funniest thing in the world. She's so naive. She thinks we're the perfect family. Richard laughed too. That sound that used to make me feel warm now pierced my chest like a knife. My poor Eleanor, he said with a tone he had never used with me, full of contempt, 32 years pretending to care. At least with you, I can be myself. The flowers slipped from my trembling hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. The yellow petals scattered down the hallway like dying little suns. Jessica sat up abruptly. What was that? I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Richard got out of bed, and in 3 strides reached the door, pulling it wide open. When he saw me standing there with the chrysanthemums scattered at my feet, his expression showed neither surprise nor guilt. It showed annoyance. "Eleanor," he said in the exact same tone he would use to scold a naughty child. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice sounding strange and distant. "This is my house. This is our bedroom." Jessica appeared behind him, still wrapped in my robe, without showing a single ounce of shame. In fact, she was smiling. "Hi, mother-in-law," she said in that sweet voice she always used at family gatherings. "What a surprise to see you so early." The coldness in her voice hit me like a slap. There were no apologies, no explanations, just a cruel satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "How long?" I managed to whisper. Richard sighed as if the question were a nuisance. 3 years, he said casually, as if talking about the weather. "Ever since Michael started traveling so much for work. 3 years. 3 years of family scenes where Jessica sat next to me smiling, asking for my recipes, calling me the best mother-in-law in the world. 3 years of nights where Richard came home late and told me he had important meetings. 3 years of feeling guilty for wondering why my husband seemed so distant, why he no longer touched me, why he treated me like a maid instead of his wife. Michael knows, Jessica added, and those 2 words finished destroying what was left of my world. Everyone knows, Eleanor. Your son, your mother-in-law, even the neighbors, Everyone, except you. I leaned against the wall because my legs threatened to give out. My son, my own son, knew his father was cheating on me with his wife and hadn't told me anything. The family I had cared for, fed, loved unconditionally for decades, had been laughing at me behind my back. Why? Was all I could ask. Richard shrugged. Because you're not enough anymore, Eleanor. For years now, you haven't been enough. Jessica is young, interesting, she has ambitions. You just know how to complain and make the same boring food every Sunday. Every word was like a hammer striking my soul. Jessica stepped forward and placed her hand on Richard's arm with a familiarity that spoke of years of intimacy. Don't be dramatic, she told me with that fake smile I now understood had been a mask all this time. It's better that you know now. That way we can stop pretending to be a happy family. I turned around and walked down the stairs, leaving behind the crushed chrysanthemums and the remains of my marriage. Behind me, I heard Richard say to Jessica, "It was about time." I was tired of acting. I stumbled out of the house, not knowing where to go, not understanding how the world had kept spinning when mine had just stopped forever. In the car, with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I realized I had no one to call, no one to trust. The family that had been my entire life had just revealed that I had never really been a part of it. That night I slept in the car parked at the mall, not daring to go back home. When I finally gathered the courage to return the next day, I found that Richard had changed the locks. I rang the doorbell like a stranger at my own house. Richard opened the door, but he didn't let me in. He stood in the doorway, blocking my path as if I were an annoying saleswoman. "I've come for my things," I told him, trying to maintain some dignity. "I already packed what you need," he replied dryly, pointing to 2 worn suitcases sitting by the door. "The rest stays here." I looked at the suitcases. 2 suitcases for 32 years of life. "Richard, we need to talk. We can go to counseling." "We can." "There's nothing to talk about, Eleanor." His voice was cold, calculated. "I want a divorce. My lawyer will contact you." Jessica appeared behind him, now dressed in my clothes, wearing my jewelry. She had completely moved into my house. She had taken my place as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Hello, Eleanor," she greeted me with that venomous smile. "I hope you find a nice place to live." "Where is Michael?" I asked, still harboring the hope that my son would defend me, that he would tell me this was all a nightmare. "Michael agrees with the separation," Richard lied, even though I knew it wasn't a lie. He says it's for the best. At that moment, I saw my mother-in-law, Martha, peeking out from the living room, the woman I had cared for during her twilight years, whom I had taken to the doctor, with whom I had spent entire afternoons listening to stories of her youth. When our eyes met, she simply looked away. "The car keys." Richard held out his hand. "What? The car is in my name. The keys." I felt as if I had been slapped. The car I had driven for 5 years, in which I had gone to work every day, in which I had taken my granddaughter to the park, was no longer mine. With trembling hands, I took the keys out of my purse and handed them to him. Richard took them without looking me in the eye. "How am I going to get to work?" I asked, feeling desperation take over my voice. "That is no longer my problem," he replied. "I also spoke with Robert at the office. He says they no longer need your services." The world swayed beneath my feet. Robert was Richard's cousin, the owner of the construction company where I had worked for 15 years as an accountant. In a single conversation, Richard had destroyed my job security. "You can't do that. I have rights." Richard laughed, but it wasn't a joyful laugh. It was cruel, calculated. "Rights, Eleanor? Everything is in my name. The house, the car, the bank accounts. You never wanted to get involved in financial matters, remember? You always said I was better with numbers, that you were right. For years, every time I tried to participate in financial decisions, Richard convinced me it was better for him to handle everything. "You take care of the house, I'll take care of the money," he would say with that smile I thought was sincere. Now I understood it had been a trap. "The savings account," I whispered. "Closed yesterday," Jessica said with satisfaction. Richard needed the money for some major expenses. I stood there with my 2 suitcases. No car, no job, no house, no money. 32 years of marriage reduced to the clothes I could carry. You can't leave me on the street, I said, my voice breaking. I'm not leaving you on the street, Richard shot back. I'm setting you free. Now you can go wherever you want. Do whatever you want. Isn't that what women your age always say? That they want independence? Jessica clung to Richard's arm with an intimacy that hurt me more than all their words combined. Maybe it's your chance to grow, mother-in-law, to learn to fend for yourself. I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I'll call Michael, I said as a last resort. Michael already knows everything, Richard replied. I explained the situation to him. He agrees this is for the best. He says it's time you grow up and stop depending on others. Those words hit me like a stab wound. My own son, the boy I had raised, fed, comforted through every nightmare, had decided I was the problem. I grabbed my suitcases with a dignity I didn't know I had left and walked away from the house. I had nowhere to go. My sister lived out of state, and we hadn't spoken in years. My parents were dead. The friends I thought I had turned out to be more Richard's friends than mine. And when I called them over the following days, they all had excuses not to take me in. I ended up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paying by the night with the little cash I had in my wallet. The room smelled of dampness and cheap disinfectant. I sat on the hard bed and finally let the tears fall. 3 days later, when my motel money ran out, my salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. Rose, the woman who cleaned the offices where I used to work, approached me in the parking lot of the supermarket where I had been looking for a job without success. Mrs. Eleanor, she told me, with that soft voice she always had, I heard what happened. If you need a place to stay. Rose lived in a small house in a modest neighborhood. She offered me a tiny 40-square-foot room at the back of her house, barely big enough for a twin bed and a small dresser. It had no windows, just a skylight that let in a little light during the day. I can't pay you right now, I told her, ashamed. You'll figure it out when you can, Rose replied, with a kindness that made me cry all over again. That first night in Rose's little room, lying on a bed that creaked with every movement, staring up at the skylight where only the stars could be seen, I realized how small my life had become. From being the lady of a 2-story house with a yard, the respected wife of a successful businessman, I had become a 59-year-old woman living off the charity of a woman who made minimum wage cleaning offices. Richard was right about one thing. I was no longer enough, but not in the way he thought. I was no longer enough to let myself be trampled on. 2 months had passed living in Rose's little room when the call came that would change everything. It was a gray Tuesday in October, and I was sitting at the small desk Rose had set up in the corner of my room, filling out job applications I knew no one would answer. At 59, with no work references because Richard had made sure to tarnish my reputation, finding a job had become impossible. The phone rang with that sharp tone that always startled me. Rose answered from the kitchen, and a few minutes later, she knocked softly on my door. Mrs. Eleanor, she said in a strange voice, it's for you. He says he's from the firm where you used to work. My stomach tightened. What could Robert possibly want with me after firing me without even a decent explanation? I took the phone with trembling hands. Eleanor, it's Robert. His voice sounded uncomfortable, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. I need you to come to the office. You have to pick up some things from your desk that we missed. What things? I asked, confused. When I left, I was sure I had taken everything personal. Just come. Yes, it's important. He hung up without giving me a chance to ask any more questions. Rose, who had been listening from the door, offered me money for the bus. I can't keep accepting your charity, I told her. Even though I knew I had no other option. Favors are paid back when you can, she replied with that simple wisdom that had kept me sane during these difficult weeks. The bus ride to Harrison Construction took me an hour and a half. It had been my workplace for 15 years, where I had arrived as a young, newlywed accountant and where I had grown professionally to become the head accountant. Now I viewed it from the outside like a stranger. Robert was waiting for me in the lobby, avoiding my gaze. He was a man in his mid-40s, Richard's second cousin, who had always been cordial with me but never close. Eleanor, he greeted me dryly. Follow me. We walked in silence to what had been my office. Someone else was already using my desk. A young woman who looked at me curiously before discreetly stepping out when Robert signaled her. "Look," Robert said, pointing to a cardboard box on the floor. "We were cleaning out the old archive in the basement and found this. It has your name on it." I approached the box. Sure enough, on a yellowed label, Eleanor Davis was written in my mother's handwriting. Davis was my maiden name. "My mother," I whispered. "What are my mother's things doing here?" Robert shrugged. "I have no idea. The basement archive has documents from over 20 years ago. Your mother worked here before you did, right?" I nodded, vaguely remembering that my mother had worked as a secretary at this company for a few years, long before I started. She had died when I was 30, and honestly, I had never asked much about her previous jobs. "Take the box," Robert said, checking his watch impatiently. "We can't keep personal items indefinitely." The trip back was torturous, carrying the heavy box on the crowded bus. When I finally reached Rose's little room, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. I set the box on the floor and sat on the bed, staring at it as if it were a bomb that could explode. Rose knocked on the door with 2 cups of tea. "What did you find?" "Things of my mother's," I answered. "But I don't understand what they could be. She never told me about keeping anything important at her work." "Sometimes mothers keep secrets to protect their children," Rose said, with that wisdom that seemed to come from years of watching life from the margins. That night, after eating the chicken broth Rose had prepared, I gathered the courage to open the box. Inside were old folders, some photographs, and yellowed papers. Most appeared to be unimportant work documents, payroll forms from the 80s, routine business letters. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from moisture, I found a brown leather folder with my name written in my mother's elegant calligraphy. I opened it with trembling hands. The first page was a letter addressed to me, dated just 3 years before my mother's death. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and that somehow you have found what I kept for you. Forgive me for not telling you this while I was alive, but I wanted to protect you from a burden that was not yours to bear." My heart began to beat faster. I kept reading. "Your father and I had a lot of financial problems during your childhood, more than you ever knew. But before I met your father, I had worked and saved money. When I got married, I decided to keep those savings a secret as a safety net for the future. Over time, those savings grew." The letter went on to explain that my mother had discreetly invested in some small properties and had maintained bank accounts that my father never knew about. But what left me breathless was the following paragraph. "After your wedding to Richard, something about him unsettled me. He was too controlling, too interested in managing everything. I decided to do some investigating and discovered things that worried me greatly. That's why I made a decision. To save all this for you, for the day you might need it." My hands shook as I turned to the next page. There were copies of bank documents, deeds to 2 small properties downtown, and life insurance policies I knew nothing about. But what truly took my breath away was what I found in the sealed envelope taped to the last page of the folder. Inside were bills, a lot of bills. I counted them 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. $50,000 in cash. Next to the money was a plane ticket to Cairo, Egypt, dated for the following week, and a note written in the same elegant handwriting of my mother. "Just go. Your true fortune awaits you." I sat on the floor of the little room, surrounded by documents and cash, feeling as if I were in a dream. Rose walked in without knocking, as she did when she was worried about me, and stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the money spread out. "Good Lord," she whispered. "Where did all that come from?" "From my mother," I replied, my voice sounding strange and distant. Apparently, she had a secret life I never knew about. I took the plane ticket and studied it. It was real, fully paid for under my name, but the strangest part was the date. It had been purchased just 3 days ago, long after my mother's death. "I don't understand," I told Rose. "My mother died almost 30 years ago. How can there be a ticket bought last week?" Rose sat next to me and took the letter, reading it carefully. "Look at the date here," she pointed to a paragraph I had overlooked. "It says that if anything happened to you, she had left instructions with a lawyer to activate certain, what does it say here? Certain protocols." I followed her finger to the indicated paragraph. Sure enough, My mother had retained the services of a lawyer in Cairo, a Mr. Hassan Khalil, with specific instructions to contact me if she died, and I went through extreme hardship. But how did he know I was in trouble? I asked. The answer was on the next page. My mother had set up a trust with instructions that my situation be discreetly monitored every few years. When the divorce became public and my financial ruin became evident, the lawyer had activated the contingency plan my mother had designed decades ago. "Your mother loved you very much," Rose said softly, "and she was very smart." I looked at the plane ticket again. The flight left in 5 days. On the note was an address in Cairo and the name of the lawyer, Hassan Khalil. "What am I going to do in Egypt?" I wondered aloud. "What your mother wanted you to do," Rose answered. "Find your true fortune." That night I couldn't sleep. The money was hidden under my pillow. The ticket in my hands. For the first time in months, I had options. I could stay, use the money to rent a small apartment, look for a job with peace of mind, or I could do what my mother was asking me from the grave, trust her one more time. By dawn, I had made my decision. The flight to Cairo was the first time I had ever left the country in my life. Richard had always said that traveling abroad was an unnecessary expense, that we had enough to see in our own country. Now, sitting in the window seat, watching the clouds stretch endlessly beneath the plane, I realized how many experiences I had missed out on by trusting the opinions of a man who turned out to be a stranger. The Cairo airport was a chaos of sounds, smells, and languages I didn't understand. I felt like a lost little girl until I saw an older man holding a sign that read Eleanor Davis in carefully written letters. "Mrs. Davis?" he asked in heavily accented English. I nodded, and he smiled broadly. "I am Hassan Khalil. Your mother was a very wise woman." Hassan was a man in his 70s with completely white hair and kind eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. He wore an impeccable suit despite the sweltering Cairo heat. "I don't understand anything that's happening," I told him as he took my suitcase. "You will understand soon," he replied with a mysterious smile. "Your mother asked me to tell you something when I saw you. Eleanor was always stronger than she believed. She just needed a reason to prove it." Those words made me cry right there in the middle of the airport. They sounded exactly like something my mother would have said. Hassan took me to a modest but clean hotel in downtown Cairo. "Rest today," he told me. "Tomorrow we will start with the legal matters." That night, from the window of my room, I looked out at the city lights and wondered what had led my mother to connect my destiny with this place so far from everything I knew. The next morning, Hassan picked me up early and took me to his office, an old building with high ceilings and slowly turning ceiling fans. The walls were lined with books in Arabic and framed diplomas. "Your mother came here for the first time in 1978, Hassan began, opening a thick file. "She was 25 and pregnant with you." I was dumbfounded. "My mother was in Egypt?" "Yes," Hassan continued. "She worked for an American company that did business here. She was a translator. She spoke Arabic perfectly." "Your father never knew." The image I had of my mother crumbled and rebuilt itself in seconds. I had always seen her as a simple woman, dedicated to the home and family. I never knew she had an international career. "When your father started having problems with alcohol," Hassan continued, "your mother made a very smart decision. She started sending money here, to Egypt, where your father would never find it." Hassan showed me documents proving that my mother had been investing in Egyptian real estate for over 20 years. Small apartments in Cairo, plots of land on the outskirts of the city, even a stake in a small boutique hotel near the pyramids. "But the most important thing," Hassan said, turning to another section of the file, "is this." He showed me the deeds to an entire building in the Zamalek neighborhood, an upscale area of Cairo. The building had 8 apartments and 2 commercial spaces on the ground floor. "All this is mine?" I asked, feeling dizzy. "It's all been in your name since your mother died," Hassan confirmed. "But she asked me not to tell you until you truly needed it." The numbers Hassan showed me next left me speechless. The apartments were all rented out, generating a monthly income of approximately $8,000. The boutique hotel, managed by local partners, brought in another $5,000 a month. The other properties added another $3,000. $16,000 a month, I repeated, unable to fully process it. Your mother was very smart with investments, Hassan smiled, and very cautious. She knew that someday you might need independence. I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to take in the information. My mother, the woman I remembered scrubbing floors and cooking simple meals, had secretly been a successful international investor. Why didn't she ever tell me? I finally asked. Hassan leaned back in his chair. She told me once, if Eleanor knows she has a safety net, maybe she will never learn to be strong on her own. But if someday she loses everything, then she'll know she can build something new. Those words echoed in my chest like an echo of my mother's wisdom. Even after she was dead, she had been watching over me, preparing me for this moment. There's more, Hassan said, opening another envelope. Your mother also investigated Richard. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? Hassan handed me a folder full of documents. Your mother hired a private investigator in 1995, 5 years after your wedding. Even then, she had noticed things that worried her about Richard's character. The documents revealed a pattern of behavior that took my breath away. Richard had cheated on his first girlfriend with another woman. Before marrying me, he had lied about some of his college degrees. He had had gambling problems during the early years of our marriage, problems he had completely hidden from me. Your mother knew that someday Richard would hurt you, Hassan explained. That's why she set all this up. She wanted you to have options when that day came. The last page of the file contained a personal letter from my mother written a few months before her death. Eleanor, it said, if you are reading this in Hassan's office, it means your world has collapsed. It means Richard finally showed his true colors. But I want you to know something. The pain you feel right now is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your freedom. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I continued reading. I built this for you, my daughter, not just the money and the properties, but the proof that you are capable of more than you imagine. You are my daughter, and I never surrendered to anything. Now it's your turn to show what you're made of. Hassan handed me a tissue and waited patiently while I processed everything. What do I have to do now? I finally asked. Whatever you want, he replied simply. You can stay here and manage the properties directly. You can return to your country and manage them from there. You can sell them and start something completely new. Your mother gave you options, Mrs. Eleanor. Infinite options. That afternoon, Hassan took me to see the building in Zamalek. It was beautiful, modern Arabic style, with balconies overlooking the Nile. The tenants, who didn't know I was the new owner, seemed happy and satisfied. Your mother chose the property managers very well, Hassan explained. Everything runs perfectly without you having to worry about the daily details. We went up to the roof, where there was a small terrace with a panoramic view of the city. The sun was setting over the Nile, painting the sky orange and pink. Your mother used to come up here when she visited Cairo, Hassan told me. She said that from here, she could see the future. I stood there watching the city stretch out before me, feeling for the first time in months that I had control over my life. Richard thought he was destroying me, but without knowing it, he had set me free to claim the inheritance my mother had carefully built for me. That night, in my hotel room, I called Rose to tell her everything. Her joy was so genuine, it made me cry again. When are you coming back? She asked. I looked out the window at the lights of Cairo, at this city that was now a part of my life in a way I had never imagined. Soon, I told her, but first I have to decide what kind of woman I'm going to be when I return. Because one thing was clear, the Eleanor who would return home would no longer be the same one who had been abandoned in a 40-square-foot room. I returned from Cairo 3 weeks later, but I did not come back as the same woman who had left. Hassan had helped me set up all the necessary bank transfers so that my new financial reality was completely legal and transparent. The $16,000 a month would start arriving in an account I had opened at a different bank, far from any institution where Richard might have influence. But I didn't come back to make announcements or throw celebrations. I came back to observe. Rose welcomed me with tears of joy and a hug that reminded me why there were few truly good people in the world. I told her everything, showed her the documents Hassan had given me, and together we watched my new life take shape. What are you going to do now? Rose asked me while we drank tea in her small kitchen. First, I'm going to take care of you, I told her, handing her an envelope with $5,000 in cash. This is for giving me a home when no one else did. Rose cried and protested, but I insisted. Then I proposed something I had been thinking about during the flight back. Rose, I want you to be my property manager here. I'll pay you $2,000 a month to handle certain things for me, but the first task is going to require a lot of discretion. Her eyes lit up with curiosity. What do you need? I need you to find out everything you can about Richard and Jessica's current situation, but without them knowing you're doing it. Rose turned out to be a natural investigator. Within a week, she had more information about my ex-husband than I had gathered in 32 years of marriage. Things are not going well in that house, Rose reported to me one afternoon with a notebook full of notes. Jessica is getting tired of Richard. Apparently, the honeymoon phase between my ex-husband and my ex-daughter-in-law had ended abruptly when Jessica realized that Richard wasn't as prosperous as he appeared. The construction business was going through hard times, and Richard had been financing their lifestyle with credit cards and loans. Jessica has been seeing other men, Rose continued. She was spotted at the mall with a younger guy, getting very affectionate. The neighbors say Richard hasn't noticed, but she doesn't even bother to hide it. The irony was delicious. Richard had destroyed his marriage with me for a woman who was now cheating on him in the exact same way. And Michael? I asked, feeling a pang of pain at the mention of my son. Your son is having problems in his own marriage, Rose said gently. It seems his wife isn't too happy that he allowed his mother to be thrown out of the family. That information hurt me and made me glad at the same time. Maybe my son was beginning to understand the consequences of his choices. What else? I asked her. Rose consulted her notes. Richard owes money all over town. The bank is starting to ask questions about the house mortgage, and there are rumors that some of his construction clients aren't paying because the jobs aren't being finished on time. I spent several days thinking about what to do with this information. I didn't want revenge in the dramatic sense of the word. I didn't need to publicly humiliate Richard or cause a scene, but I did want justice. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose everything because of the actions of someone you trusted. The opportunity came when Rose discovered something very interesting. Mrs. Eleanor, she told me excitedly one morning, remember you told me Richard always managed all the money in your marriage? I nodded. Well, it turns out he was never as good with numbers as he pretended. I found someone who worked at his company 10 years ago. He says Richard always relied on outside accountants to keep the books straight, that he was only good at getting clients, but the numbers confused him. An idea began to form in my mind. For 15 years, I had managed complex accounting. I knew exactly how loans, mortgages, and cash flows worked in a construction company. Rose, I said slowly, do you think you could find out exactly how much Richard owes and to whom? A week later, Rose had acquired information that left me amazed. Richard owed approximately $250,000 spread among several creditors. The mortgage bank, 3 building material suppliers, 2 subcontractors who hadn't been paid, and several credit cards. But the most interesting part was that one of the companies he owed money to was up for sale. Jenkins Building Supplies, Rose read from her notes. Richard owes them $65,000, and they're looking for a buyer for the business because the owner wants to retire. That night, I called Hassan in Cairo. Hassan, I need to make a purchase here, a small company that costs around $200,000. Is it a good investment? He asked in his practical voice. It's the best investment I can make, I replied. It's going to give me back something I lost. A week later, Eleanor Davis became the owner of Jenkins Building Supplies. The previous owner was so desperate to sell that he accepted my offer of $200,000 without asking too many questions. My first act as the new owner was to review all outstanding accounts, and there it was. Richard Harrison owed $65,000 for materials delivered but not paid for. I sent him a formal letter signed by the lawyer I had hired, giving him 30 days to pay the debt in full or face legal action. Rose was at my small new apartment when the response arrived. Yes, I had bought a small but decent apartment, nothing flashy, but entirely mine. What does it say? Rose asked, watching me read the letter. He says he needs more time, that he's going through temporary financial difficulties, I read aloud. He says it's unfair for a company to change ownership and suddenly demand immediate payment of old debts. I laughed. It was exactly the kind of excuse Richard had always used when he didn't want to take responsibility. I replied through my lawyer. Debts do not change ownership when companies change hands. The payment is due in 20 days or we will proceed legally. 10 days later, Rose came running to my apartment. "Mrs. Eleanor, you have to see this," she said, waving a local newspaper. In the classified section, there was an ad. "House for sale in Oakwood Estates. Urgent, price negotiable." It was my old house, the house where I had lived for 32 years, where I had raised my son, where I had believed I would be happy forever. "They're desperate," Rose murmured. That afternoon, I called the number in the ad using a fake name. A female voice answered. It was Jessica. "Hi, I'm calling about the house for sale," I said, slightly altering my voice. Yes, Jessica replied, sounding agitated. "When can you come see it? We need to sell urgently." "What's the price?" I didn't even ask. "We're asking $300,000, but we're willing to negotiate," she said quickly. "If you can pay in cash?" The house Richard and I had bought together, that we had paid for together for years, was now being sold for a fraction of its true value because they desperately needed money. "Let me think about it," I told her, and hung up. That night, sitting in my small apartment, I looked out the window at the city lights. My mother was right. The pain had not been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of my freedom, and now I had to decide exactly how to use that freedom. So, 2 months after returning from Cairo, I decided it was time to close this chapter of my life the right way. Not with screaming or drama, but with the kind of silent justice my mother had taught me from the grave. Richard had not paid the $65,000 he owed my company, and the legal deadline had passed. My lawyer informed me that we could proceed with foreclosing on his assets, starting with the house. "Are you sure you want to do this?" the lawyer asked me. "Once we start the process, there's no going back." "Completely sure," I replied. "Proceed." But before the legal process took its course, I decided to do something I had been putting off for months. It was time to visit my son. Michael lived in a small apartment on the other side of town. His marriage, according to Rose's reports, was in crisis ever since his wife had started questioning how he had treated his mother. Apparently, having a conscience had turned out to be more complicated than my son had anticipated. I knocked on his door on a Saturday morning. When he opened it, his face went through a sequence of emotions. Surprise, guilt, fear, and finally something that might have been relief. "Mom," he said simply. "Hello, Michael." We stood in the doorway for a moment that felt like an eternity. He had lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and his apartment behind him looked messy and sad. "Can I come in?" I asked. He nodded, stepping aside. His apartment was small and depressing. Unpacked boxes suggested his separation from his wife was more recent than Rose had reported. "How did you find me?" he asked, offering me the only chair that looked comfortable. "Michael, I'm your mother. I will always know where you are." He sat on a kitchen chair with his hands clasped, avoiding my gaze. "I heard things aren't going well with your father," I said directly. His shoulders tensed. "Things are complicated." "Complicated how?" Michael sighed deeply. "Jessica left last week. She took half the things in the house and disappeared with some guy she met at the gym. I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction, though I tried not to show it. My dad is. He's drinking a lot," my son continued, his voice breaking slightly. "He says everything is your fault, that you ruined his life. And what do you think?" I asked gently. Michael finally looked me in the eyes, and I saw the little boy he had been, the young man I had raised with so much love. "I think I made a mistake, Mom. I think I made a terrible mistake." The words I had been waiting to hear for months finally left his lips. But to my surprise, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. I only felt sadness for all the lost time. "Michael," I told him calmly, "your father is going to lose the house." His face went pale. "What do you mean? He owes money he can't pay." "A lot of money. The house is going to be foreclosed on. Can you help him?" he asked desperately. The question hurt me. Not because I didn't want to help, but because after everything that had happened, his first instinct was still to protect his father. "Michael," I said softly, "your father threw me out of my own house, took my job, left me with no money, no car, nothing. He humiliated me and betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. Why do you think I should help him?" My son broke down then, crying like I hadn't seen him cry since he was little. "Because I failed you," he sobbed. "Because I was a coward and didn't defend you when I should have. Because I chose the easy side instead of the right side." I walked over to him, and for the first time in months, I touched my son. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Son," I said, "choices have consequences. Your father is living the consequences of his choices, and you are living the consequences of yours. Are you going to forgive me?" he asked, lifting his head to look at me. "I already have," I answered honestly, "but forgiveness doesn't erase the consequences." I then explained to him what I had decided to do. I wasn't going to stop the legal process against Richard. The debt was real, the non-payment was real, and the consequences had to be real too. But I did have a proposal for Michael. "I'm going to offer you a job at my new company," I told him. "You have experience in construction, and I need someone to oversee some projects. The salary will be fair, the terms will be clear, and there will be no special favors just because you're my son." His eyes lit up with a cautious hope. "Really? Really? But there are conditions. First, your father cannot know you work for me until I decide to tell him. Second, you earn this job, I am not handing it to you as a gift. Third, if you ever choose against me again when things get tough, this opportunity disappears forever." Michael nodded vigorously. I accept everything." 3 weeks later, the foreclosure on the house proceeded exactly as my lawyer had predicted. Richard lost the house, the furniture, and what little capital he had left from the business. Rose brought me the details with her usual efficiency. "Richard is living in a small apartment near downtown," she reported. "Jessica never came back. His son is helping him a little, but apparently he doesn't have much to offer." What Rose didn't know was that Michael was working for me under a different corporate name, managing the renovation of 2 of my properties in Cairo through local contacts. It was good, honest work, and he was learning to earn a living on his own merits. 6 months after the foreclosure, Rose arrived with news that surprised me. "Richard wants to see you," she said. "He sent a message through an acquaintance. He says he needs to speak with you urgently." "About what?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. He didn't say, but the acquaintance told me he looks terrible, that he's lost a lot of weight, and looks much older. I thought for several days about whether I wanted to see Richard, not for him, but for me, to completely close this chapter of my life. I finally agreed to meet him at a neutral coffee shop, a place where there were many people and where neither of us would have an advantage over the other. When I arrived at the cafe, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had been my husband for 32 years looked emaciated, aged, defeated. His clothes, though clean, were cheap and fit him poorly. He had become a shadow of the arrogant man who had thrown me out of my own home. "Eleanor," he said when he saw me, trying to smile. "You look good," he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice because I did look good. I looked like a 59-year-old woman who had found her place in the world. "What do you need?" I asked directly. Richard lowered his head. "I know you bought Jenkins Building Supplies. I know you were the one who initiated the legal process. Why, Eleanor? Why did you do this to me?" The question was so absurd I almost laughed. "Richard, I did exactly to you what you did to me. I took your house, your stability, your sense of security. The only difference is that I had legal grounds to do it. But you're better than me," he said desperately. "You were always better than me." "You're right," I answered calmly. "I am better than you, which is why it ends here." Richard looked up in confusion. "I'm not going to keep destroying you," I continued. "Not because I can't, but because I don't want to become the kind of person you are." I handed him an envelope I had prepared. "What is this?" he asked. "It's the deed to a small apartment. It's fully paid for. It's yours." Richard opened the envelope, reading the documents in disbelief. "I don't understand." "It's my parting gift, Richard. A place where you can live without depending on anyone else. But it comes with a condition." "What?" "Never contact me again. Never mention my name again. Never interfere in my life or our son's life ever again. This apartment is your freedom and my freedom." Richard began to cry then. Tears he hadn't shed when he threw me out of the house. Tears he hadn't shed when he took my job away. "Eleanor, I cut him off. There is nothing more to say." I stood up to leave, but he grabbed my hand. "Can you forgive me?" I looked one last time at this man who had been the center of my life for so many years and felt nothing. No love, no hate, no pain, just indifference. "I already have," I told him. "That is the reason I can give you this and walk away." I walked out of the cafe and never saw him again. 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of my building in Cairo, watching the sunset over the Nile. Hassan had become not just my lawyer, but a dear friend. Michael was successfully managing 3 renovation projects and had begun to rebuild his marriage with the honest work and honesty he had learned far too late. Rose was still my property manager, but she now lived in her own house that I had bought for her, and she managed a small network of properties that generated income for us both. My phone rang. It was Michael. "Mom," he said, and his voice sounded different, more mature, more secure. "I wanted to thank you." "What for?" "For teaching me that real strength doesn't come from controlling others, but from controlling yourself." After hanging up, I sat watching the lights of Cairo turn on one by one. My mother was right. The pain hadn't been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of my true life. At 60 years old, I had finally learned that the sweetest revenge is not destroying the one who hurts you, but building a life so fulfilling that their absence becomes irrelevant. And that life, I thought as the Nile reflected the stars, is just beginning.